So the overall picture here is that the global elite are using mass migration as a passive weapon to erode border integrity and transition us to full liquid modernity, in which there are no longer any obstacles to the global flow of culture, labor, capital. They're immediately directly enriched by this process, but the end goal is more or less the total dismantling of the nation state, which is really the last bastion of resistance to absolute liquefaction. The political goal of this weaponization is to transition us to post national sovereignty. The apparatuses for global rule are already really established. That's like the function of international organizations and the NGOs. And this is really the core of the opposition to Trump. Trump's primary political significance is to shore up national sovereignty and resist the movement to post national global order. It's the transcendental signified of all of his actions in the domain of politics. And that's the cause of the anathematization of MAGA as domestic extremists or whatever. The fact that it wants to concern itself with the domestic at all, that MAGA wants to concern itself with the domestic at all, is what makes it extreme to liquid capital, right? So mass migration is deployed in a steady stream, specifically into wealthy Western nations, and this drives down wages, destroys social cohesion, any sense of collective identity or purpose. You get rapid demographic changes, it erodes norms and local institutions, it decultures people, turns them into isolated individual consumers. And with this passive weaponization, you get the effect without the need for explicit aggression. Migration is both a tool used to accomplish the erosion of national sovereignty and also a byproduct of the progressive erosion of national sovereignty, accelerating the accomplishment of the dissolution of borders without the need to really formally dismantle them via a direct political process, which of course the people would oppose. And they would oppose it for good reasons. People know intuitively how important national sovereignty is. There are theorists like Habermas, for example, who advocate for like what he calls cosmopolitan democracy. And he thinks the nation state has become antiquated. It can't resolve the issues that we face really in the modern world, issues like climate change, which, by the way, the climate change industry is also part of this kind of open border propaganda apparatus. But so he thinks for that reason we need global governance. Kwame Anthony Appiah is another philosopher that makes these arguments. I think I have some stuff on him. I think I talked about him in my nominalism video. And he writes articles like there is no Western civilization because we got Aristotle from the Muslims who preserved those texts when they were destroyed or lost in Europe. And so we can't identify any kind of continuity of a tradition. So really, there's no such thing as the West or Europe or anything like that. This is all ridiculous, fallacious reasoning. Again, you can check out like my nominalism video to get more insight into that. But he also views identity as inherently fluid, thinks nationalism is exclusionary, it's cruel, and it's bigoted. He thinks we have global ethical obligations. And this is the sort of stuff that Peter Singer says too. He's another big philosopher, and his like sort of famous ethical experiment is like you're walking by a pond, there's a kid drowning in it, you're wearing fancy clothes, they'll be ruined if you get in the pond. Should you jump in and save the kid? Everyone responds to this thought experiment by saying, yeah, screw the clothes, right? And he wants to point out, like, how is this different than if I could donate some money instead of buying the clothes and save a child's life that way? He says that's the situation that we're in as wealthy nations. You could donate and save a child's life in Africa. The only real difference, he thinks, is proximity, and that seems arbitrary. Technologically, the modern world has made everybody sort of proximate anyway. National boundaries are really arbitrary, and so he thinks we have a moral responsibility to the global poor. These are the sorts of intellectual justifications you get about open borders. But citizenship, which, for example, Hannah Arendt thinks is the right to have rights, is predicated on exclusion. We form a community of shared interest and mutual obligation. We share an identity, and you form a social contract. You become a political agent with a role, with the power to help shape your destiny. Citizenship affords you a duty with legal protections, and it can't be universal. The outside has to be sacrificed for the inside. If there's no outside, there's no choice, there's no loss. Total inclusion and total exclusion are ultimately the same phenomenon. Without borders and a defined citizenry, individuals get reduced to mere abstract units, stripped of the stable affiliations and reciprocal duties that grant them political agency. And so a borderless cosmopolitan world is really what Hannah Arendt feared most, a system where people become rightsless. They're reduced to the status of economic agents and consumers with no political standing. That's what the global order ultimately represents. Similarly, like for Alasdair MacIntyre, the erosion of the nation state risks turning individuals into what he calls moral strangers. In a world of liquid global markets, the disintegration of shared traditions and local ties in favor of a borderless transnational society disorients people. It strips them of the context that gives ethical meaning to their actions. Without the boundaries provided by communities, which the nation state insulates and protects, you get a world where individuals are just set adrift. They're governed only by impersonal economic logic and kind of anomic hedonistic individualism. Agamben is another theorist that I like, who has gone even further than these two, I think, in thinking about these issues, particularly in the wake of COVID. And again, I've got some videos on Agamben and his commentary on COVID. And he points out that the defining characteristics of modern political systems is what he calls the state of exception, which is the suspension of legal norms in the name of security or public health or economic stability or something like that. And that this trend is accelerating and expanding to supranational governance. And so we're moving increasingly in the direction of a kind of global regime in which the state of exception is deployed. And that would be capable of a kind of totalitarianism, he says, that the Nazis and Soviet communists could only dream about due to modern technologies of control we have at our disposal. Another element of his analysis is what he calls the homo sacer, which was a person in ancient Rome who could be killed with impunity. They're divested of citizenship. Without the protections of a citizen, they're no longer Roman. And he used to talk about this in terms of terrorism. Suspected terrorists could be denied habeas corpus, tortured, surveilled without receiving a search warrant, etc. And so the homo sacer exists outside of the world of jurisprudence. Um, he also talks about migrants like this, refugees, and he talks about COVID like this, people being reduced to bare life, to mere animal zoological status, and manipulated in a kind of extra legal fashion. And so, like, man is a political animal, but in the state of exception, becoming homo sacer, he becomes merely an animal. And in the post-national world, and with the liquidation of all of these forms of stable identity, of culture, etc., what's happening is we're being increasingly reduced to that, to bare life, he calls it. And governance is about increasingly the management of human beings as a species in their biology. We're becoming borderless animal subjects, not citizens, right? In the global order, we won't be citizens, we won't be American citizens. We'll be sort of vectors of production and consumption, economic zones, vectors of illness, of reproduction, of pollution. And he points out that in a global order with global governance, every dispute would also be like a civil dispute. And so we get the movement toward a permanent global civil war, which again justifies a declaration of a state of exception, which in this case would be a global state of exception. Every local issue becomes global, and the resolution can only be global. And so people in Puerto Rico, they're polluting or not reproducing enough or something like that, right? The only way to solve a problem like this would be imposed by a kind of global elite. They're a global problem, and so there has to be a kind of global solution. They don't have any specific political status. They don't get to make their own laws. They don't get to determine what they do for themselves. They're domestic extremists in a kind of global context, and so they have to be forced to comply or be abolished. There's no different strokes for different folks. There's no refuge, right, from sort of global power, right, from the global exercise of power. There's just this global bureaucracy that tells everyone everywhere they all have to do the same thing. It's a universal command to all human beings from which there's no refuge, there's no respite. Um, you have to just submit without local protections and specific constitutional rights that nation states provide. Individuals lose their shield against this kind of unfettered power. Sloterdijk is another theorist I have talked a lot about. And for him, this isn't even just a political problem, it's an immunological problem, a psychological problem. The nation state was an immunological structure that protects a people's way of life, values, identity. In the era of foamic immunology, he calls these things foams, spherologically. Um, we needed the nation state. The nation state provided us with security. It protected us from threats external to us, external worldviews, external ideas, etc. It allowed us to have a kind of internal coherence. And our psychological well being, when the nation state is gone, becomes more fragile. Our protective mechanisms are weakened. We live in isolated but interconnected bubbles next to each other, but sort of lacking in any binding connection or solidarity with other people. You just get sort of temporary friendships, temporary alliances of convenience, and they're ultimately meaningless. And so you wind up with social fragmentation, isolated, disconnected, lonely people lacking any sense of purpose or meaning. And this entails for Sloterdijk a lot of psychopathology, nihilism, aggression, paranoia, a kind of schizophrenia. And so I think theoretically we should understand that the erosion of national sovereignty is a crisis, right? It's a real, very serious problem, despite what somebody like Apaya says or whatever. And we need to respond to it. We need to prevent it. And mass migration is being used as a weapon to produce this situation.